we're going to start out with questions and conversations amongst the panelists and Nore, and then, as we mentioned earlier, after a little bit, we'll start taking your questions. In the next few minutes, if our volunteers can start just drifting along to the sides, and if you have questions, if you've already sketched out some questions, you can start, as you see the volunteers, pass those over to the side. So let's get started, and perhaps, Morgan, how about let me turn it over to you, and if you've got some questions or thoughts that you'd like to express with Nore.
So I'm curious, as you're inventorying different neighborhoods, what are there certain characteristics that you're looking for in terms of houses that represent for the neighborhood, in terms of, like, you mentioned materials. Are there, when we're doing a historic, forming a historic district, we look for the houses that are contributing versus non-contributing. Are there homes that you sort of exclude from that inventory as you're developing your analysis?
Well, you look at everything, but you do want to look at what are the predominant development patterns in those neighborhoods. In many cases, those are going to be the traditional older characteristics of uniform setbacks, building materials, form and shape, etc. But that's why we do try to look at what is the degree of diversity, because that in some cases is reflected in the block that's already substantially changed with more recent construction that is larger of scale. So no, you don't use blinders, but you do have to use judgment in terms of determining what is the key characteristic of the neighborhood. And of course, what I didn't talk about at all is that this is typically a very community-driven process, a lot of community engagement where people are helping to describe the features that they see and that they know on the street. I showed you the sort of the data side of that, the GIS side, but a lot of it is also a more sensory level with the community engaged.
Brandon, do you want to pick up with some questions?
So, Nore, I think many of my questions tonight are going to revolve around the world of house retention and internal conversion of existing buildings. Can you talk a little bit about how the standards approach conflicts with or supports internal conversion of houses into maybe multiple units or retention of the house for single family living? And specifically, I'm thinking about things like rear additions or elevating the house an extra story to make more living room for a growing family or for converting the house into an alternate use.
Well, these standards that I'm talking about really focus on form and not on use. And so the number of people, how they're configured inside the building is not a concern, really. It's what's the resulting mass and form on the street. Additions to the rear, are generally quite easy to accommodate within standards such as these. Elevating a structure to a point, and again, because at the point at which it begins to affect perceived mass, then there is a consideration of that. And so normally a lot of codes will have a height limit of 2 to 4 feet, beyond which if that basement is then counted as floor area ratio for that very reason, because it's going to be affecting the perceived mass. But I mean, the internal conversion thing, that's no problem with that, as long as you can meet the other codes, of course.
Sarah?
Can you hear me? Oops, in the back. I've been doing a little research on my own to try to understand what other cities do in terms of density. And certainly Portland has adopted the ADU policy of secondary sort of smaller development in existing neighborhoods. Can you give me an idea, and this is brought up because you have such a broad breadth of understanding of different cities and different codes, is that a common approach in cities, are you finding, or in terms of how they handle changing essentially single-family dwelling zones to accommodate more than one family?
Lost my juice. Yes, in single-family zones, many communities now are looking at ways of accepting and even encouraging accessory dwelling units. And certainly the Los Angeles Code is assuming that there will be an exemption of a certain amount of square footage in a detached structure. And whatever's in that structure is up to you. And California law does state that any single-family zone, any city must permit an accessory dwelling unit in a single-family zone. Now, that's different from upzoning to duplex or triplex or other kinds of residential situations where it's not an accessory dwelling unit. I'm less familiar with that. Normally, I mean, that's a rezoning into a different density or in a different residential class. But yes, I think we're seeing lots of interest around the country in promoting ADUs, an increasing level of comfort. We know there are issues about how you manage them, et cetera, but I think everyone understands that it's an important tool to be using, and we're seeing it more and more.
How about this? Yeah. You can keep your microphone, thank you. You mentioned a community process where communities decided what was important, and you also mentioned that in Los Angeles there's a concept of neighborhoods that have pretty much been fed up with change, others that welcome change. How does that play out? What's the expectation for how the community makes some of those decisions?
Well, the expectation for how those 16 flavors will be implemented is through neighborhood planning processes, through neighborhood plans, where they will identify areas that they recommend. Now, the neighborhood doesn't choose. I mean, it's not like it's a vote. The decision is still a city council decision to enact the new zoning and to map it is the distinction. What will happen is that these new zone categories will be adopted. They will be on the books and available, but they don't get mapped. They don't get put onto the ground until City Council does that through a zoning action. But that will be informed by the neighborhood plan and the policies that have been set forth through that, which of course will have been adopted as an official plan through the city planning process.
Want to pick up on some of these questions?
Thanks. So I'm curious, Los Angeles is a great example city for us to be looking at, just in terms of its geography and extent of these application of new rules. It's pretty impressive amount of work that you've undertaken. So in terms of your neighborhood planning process, 250 square miles of residential zones, if I got that stat right.
Excuse me just a second. Are you still having hearing problems hearing back there? Okay, we're just going to have to...
You'll have to keep reminding me. I'm getting this sort of echo up here.
Yeah, because we hear it so well up here.
I'm like, I got to tone it down. So I'm curious how you plan on engaging that range of community members. I mean, it's a lot of people. We have a lot of people in Portland. It's sort of a similar, neighborhood involvement is and citizen involvement is our goal one in our comp plan. We acknowledge that, and we want to include neighborhood involvement. But it's difficult when you're talking about that number of people and that many neighborhoods. Do you have suggestions about ways to do that more efficiently, or just suggestions that you'd have for that?
I wish I had some of the city staff people here to answer that question, because they're the ones in the trenches that are doing that. But it is through neighborhood meetings. It is working through with the neighborhood associations in terms of engaging them. I will say that for this second phase of the rollout, which I had to sort of speed through, there were about 16 neighborhoods that went to City Council and said, we're fed up, we want something done now. We're not going to wait till the end of this project. And so that's one of the reasons that area got spun off quickly. Those 16 neighborhoods have been very, very active and are already in the process of talking through which of those flavors they're going to want to recommend for their neighborhoods. So that's we're actually able to test right now how the planning process, the neighborhood participation process, will work in terms of informing how that's going to move forward up to the Planning Commission and the City Council.
How many unique decision-making areas are there going to be? Have you determined that? In other words, there has to be some boundary that says this group of neighborhoods, this group of houses, this group of property owners gets to collectively decide for that area, and then there's another area over here. How many of those?
Oh, there's
there?
I want to say there's something like 50 recognized neighborhood groupings within the city of Los Angeles. There's a very formal structure of neighborhood organizations and neighborhood participation. So that is all pretty clearly established. There is a formal mechanism, if you will, for how a group of neighborhoods participates in the process.
Let me just tag along
Sure,
on that. So I'm curious, as the neighborhoods are identifying the sets of standards that seem appropriate for their different areas, are so it gets down to a boundary decision eventually. The boundaries tend to follow the neighborhood boundaries, or are they completely sort of separated? The neighborhood geography is a different thing than these pattern areas that you're talking about.
Well, in theory, they can be different. That is the whole idea, is that a neighborhood known culturally as a neighborhood may have two very different typologies within the neighborhood, which may merit two very different zone districts. Now, what the city wants to avoid is a real balkanization where you're down to microzoning block by block, saying, I'm different from you. So there will be some limits on just how small an area can be mapped with its own unique zoning standards. So it's going to be somewhere in between a full neighborhood, but where clearly there is enough of that typology that can be drawn as being separate. That would be an indication that that's a zone district. And similarly, and we think this will be true in many cases, one typology is shared by three abutting neighborhoods, and so you may have a zone district that really encompasses more than one neighborhood.
Brandon, you look like you want to have a question.
I do, and I want to engage in a little deeper conversation around affordability. And so one of the things we hear in many of our planning processes here in Portland is with additional regulations or a reduction in development potential, you see an increase of cost. And what I'm curious about for you is talking to those people who might be first-time home buyers or who may be looking for a house in an inner city neighborhood that might today have a hard time affording one of those houses. Can you help us understand how increasing a level of design standard would relate with affordability and what you've learned from those other cities in terms of at the different thresholds of standards and discretionary review, do you start to get into a place that new construction becomes prohibitively expensive?
Well, gosh, there's so many parts to that question. As we all know, we're seeing a lot of new construction, in some cases unimpeded by regulation, that's very expensive. So while intuitively there is some connection between regulation and price, it's not always an immediate direct connection. In some of the projects we've worked on and others that I've been aware of, there have been parallel economic studies that look at what the potential impact or cost is of the added regulations. For a lot of the form-related standards here, these are just often talking about where you locate the building, how you shape it. It isn't necessarily saying you must use Anderson windows versus Pella. Those are, and so a lot of the things that affect price and cost are still not really regulated by the standards. Now, what we've often heard from the development community in many respects is we want more than that. We want predictability. We want to know that if we buy that piece of property, we have a buildable project. And that's where understanding that there is at least a by right channel, a track that you can take that saves time, which saves money, needs to be added into that equation of how you calculate cost and development regulation.
So I want to play audience participation. How many people in the room own a house? So, Nore, I want you to talk to the people who didn't raise their hands and help me understand why context and compatibility matters to those people who don't today own a house.
Because when they live in that neighborhood, they will care about that community. And many of them are drawn to those neighborhoods because of that character. We had a study conducted by a prominent real estate appraiser years ago down in Carmel. Carmel is off the scale of reality, and as well as price. And we were conducting analyses of visual character of the different streets, etc. And he was running his numbers separately. He said, it's funny, in the same neighborhood, we're seeing some streets where people are getting more price out of the same square footage. And it was the streets that people had mapped that most retained their traditional character and their traditional tree canopy. And it was really interesting because the realtors hadn't really caught that either, but that people were actually willing to pay a little bit more for that street with character than just the house with the granite countertop.
Sarah, you look like you're eager to comment.
Yeah, this is not based upon this comment, which is really interesting. But one of the more contentious parts of the Stakeholders Advisory Committee was where higher density areas would be located. And the city's taken a position that they be located within a quarter mile of corridors and centers, which effectively means most of the city. In your experience, what is the definition of a corridor and center, and when do they really peter out to lose that character and become a neighborhood character?
Boy, that's a hard one, Sarah. I don't know that there's a dimensional number that I'm familiar with that people have chosen. I mean, yes, corridors are where the greater intensity, those communities now, that's where they want to concentrate them for all of the same reasons you do here. What we're beginning to look at in Los Angeles, and we've done a little bit of work in the past, is what is now being called transitions. And that's either a physical transition, a stepping down or buffering of that higher intensity development to whatever the lower intensity development is. And of course, in many communities, there is actually an intermittent zone district, and that's what I was showing you briefly there in Denver, where between the corridor and the single-family zone, there are 1, 2, 3 blocks of a lower intensity residential, the duplex to fourplex or whatever range, which helps to buffer or mediate that transition. But that said, where that corridor is very abrupt, and we know it's going to be a big issue in Los Angeles because along many of the older commercial corridors there, the property depth is only 100 feet, maybe 150 feet. And yet we want to see high density developed there. And that is going to mean there will be a back edge that we're going to have to look at very carefully in terms of how you soften that through form standards. It'll be a much more compressed kind of transition than you would see in many locations. Or, actually, I didn't get to talk about a project we've been doing in Encinitas, California, where we're looking at how can developers actually combine that commercial zone shallow piece with the next abutting mid-range residential piece in a mixed-use project, rather than there being this separating line, so that you can actually get a better product out of the whole thing and not be limited by where the zoning boundary changes necessarily. In the past, you only could do that in many cities through planned unit development or planned building groups or something like that. So looking at ways that those can actually be planned together is something that we're going to be looking at in the LA project.
Do you do this through overlay zones, or is it just strictly through rezoning a certain area?
It can be done either way. Overlay zones are one way of doing it. we're trying to limit the way overlays are used because it can get confusing and whatnot. You want to try to do as much as you can in the base zoning. And so there are some tools you can use to actually build in some of that transitional aspect within a single zone without actually having to create a separate zone.
You had mentioned in Denver some instances where some fairly substantial infill construction was happening, and it was in areas that had historically been single family, but had been rezoned. Have you? Is there anything you can share with us about how Denver decided how much of their single family housing stock they were going to sacrifice for larger type construction?
Those areas were already, they already were zoned for higher density before the new code was developed. So in that case, the form standards were written for the R2, R3, or the zone categories. Now they've been renamed under the new form-based system, but it's just that simply that redevelopment hadn't happened, in part because the code was written just before the recession. And so for several years, even though new rules were in place, you weren't seeing that happening so much. But now you are.
What do you think that the new rules facilitated those conversions from being largely single family to more multifamily?
Well, I think they did. I mean, again, you could already have done that under the old code, but the new code is relatively easy to understand and interpret and administer. And so, the development community, I think, has been pleased with it in many respects for that reason, because it's easy to work with. Now, as I said, they're looking at making some changes because now they're learning, and that's the beauty with a new code, and with any code, is that it can learn. When it's time, when you realize that you need to make an adjustment, you can.
We'll have one more round of panel questions and comments, and then we'll go to the audience.
Great. So early on in your presentation, you mentioned the difference between intensity and density. And one of the sort of underpinnings of the residential infill project is within areas of a quarter mile of centers and corridors, we're limiting the size of houses using an FAR standard, but allowing the more units within that same size. So it's the premise is we are controlling the form, but allowing for more residential units in that restricted size. And I think a difference with Boulder, perhaps, and I'm not familiar enough with Boulder's code to speak to it, but I think that in Boulder's case, the different housing types allowed for something larger, which would be a difference in this approach, where we're talking 2 units in the size of something that's a house versus when you go with a different housing type, you get to go bigger, larger, more units consequently. So is that a good characterization?
Well, the Boulder project actually was only for single-family zones. So no, not in the Boulder one. The Denver one, again, there has the other higher density ones. But I think what's key there is to be certain that the form standards are still emulating or drawing from the single-family form and design tradition. Some of the things I saw today, there's some kind of counterintuitive requirements that are kind of forcing you to not look like a big house, but to look like something else. So I think if an increasing density is to be accepted in certain places, there's still an opportunity to look at how can the form fit better.
Brandon?
I just have a one-word question: parking.
I don't have a question.
Well, no one has the answer to that, and I have to admit that my wife manages the parking system for Boulder, so I hear a lot about this. And of course, a certain segment of the community would like to pretend that the car doesn't exist and argues that if we make it totally painful, that we will all stop driving. And, pain does cause us to avoid certain actions, it's true, but our degree of tolerance for pain varies from individual to individual. So we are going to have cars. And whether or not you require them or not is probably where you're heading. I mean, there are more communities that are certainly reducing the number of parking spaces required and changing their approach to how they're being treated. Los Angeles at the moment requires a covered space, an enclosed space. Talk about a suburban mentality. So that is going to change. You no longer will be required to enclose it. That means all of a sudden you can drop that amount of the mass of the building without changing much of anything, But then the question of how much parking do you require on site, or do you let everyone park in the neighborhood? Everyone's playing with different formulas in terms of what's the ratio, what are the other parking management systems, neighborhood parking permits, et cetera, that are all a part of that. That's very much a part of the Boulder system. We have a very complex method of sharing on-street parking between residents and visitors and employees that all have different kinds of parking permits within a parking permit system. That's all a part of it. Boulder is experimenting with much more aggressive ride sharing and alternative modes of trying to minimize the number of cars. But that said, we're still planning for parking as a part of most development projects, certainly of anything of any consequence in terms of scale.
I have a question about carrot and stick approach to planning and incentivizing certain outcomes. In the proposal, there is an idea that density can be increased if there are certain benefits to the community, for instance, affordable housing or ADA accessible housing or maintaining an existing structure. Do you have any good examples of where that's really been successful, or any horror stories?
Of incentivizing affordable housing, I mean, most often where I'm aware of it is where you do get, but it's along corridors and in higher density areas where you get to go up another level beyond what normally would be permitted. We're actually working on a code for Glenwood Springs, Colorado right now for a portion of the city where that will be the case. You will get an extra floor. We're talking about an area that normally would 3 floors will be permitted, and you'll be permitted to go to 4 floors if that square footage is in affordable units somewhere in the complex.
Have you noticed it's in a single-family residential zone?
Well, no, not in single-family zones, because the only ways that happens is either, of course, through a CDC or some other form that is creating affordable housing and deed restricting in some form, or where, for some developments, and I certainly know this is the case in Boulder, where a certain amount of affordable housing is required in the larger projects. You can do that on site, but you can also do it off site. And so in some cases that has happened in the neighborhoods where they may build the affordable units in an established neighborhood.
Okay, how about some questions now from the audience? Let's see, do we have UNR folks, if there's anybody who has not turned in a question card? Oh, thank you. That's a simple way to do it. Just bring it on up. So here's one. I'm just sort of grabbing these at random. How critical is the administrative burden in a city when making a choice in design review code process? In Portland, it is fee-based, and so the greater the alternates, the greater the staff cost. So I guess there's an issue. What's the burden on the city when you have a choice for a administrative design review option?
Oh, well, I guess burden in term, I use that term to mean that it does take time and effort. Yes, it may be that it's paid for in some form, but it still is an added administrative requirement in terms of operating a permitting system. So maybe burden is the wrong term if it is totally covered under permitting fees, but it still takes time to administer design review.
This is not one of these questions, but one that occurred to me during the discussion. If you of the locations where you've worked, whether you have a dual path, either a prescriptive path or an alternative design review path, what percentage of projects goes through the alternative design review type path typically?
Well, one in Durango is most people do the by right situation, and one of the things they're talking about the code learning is that they found that several people were going through the discretionary review option asking for the same thing, and they were saying, you know, we're granting this every time, let's just go ahead and put that in the base code. And so they amended the code to accommodate that particular item. So, I mean, if you like to think that if you've crafted the code correctly, then people will gravitate toward the by right condition. Maybe you've missed something in the way you've set it up or the way you've calibrated it, then you're going to see people moving more toward the design review option. I know that actually for the much larger scale projects in Denver, talking with the architects, they actually prefer the design review process because they feel they can negotiate more. They have more flexibility for things that are well beyond whatever the base code might provide. So on a big scale project, I think the developers are often willing to go that route.
Here is a question that you may or may not want to answer, but I'd like to hear your response to it. What is apparently livability has been defined as a concern in many jurisdictions. What do you see a decrease in livability being, and what is the definition of it as people tend to use it?
Well, that's mostly anecdotal. The one study I know that was done a few years ago was in Florida, where they tried to come up with some livability indicators for neighborhoods. It was still kind of, when I looked at it, I thought a little squishy, a little soft, but it was at least a noble effort at trying to get at that. I think anecdotally, it's that sense of neighborhood, a sense of being able to walk down the street and have a pedestrian-friendly environment are all part of what contributes to a sense of livability. But that would be my personal definition. But as a sense of place, a sense of connection, that you know you're in a distinct neighborhood. All of those, I think, contribute to the term livability from a physical urban design standpoint.
Here are a couple of questions that relate to this same subject. Given a neighborhood having been rezoned officially from a single family to something else, what kinds of standards and incentives might work to allow the preservation of the existing houses as opposed to the smash and rebuild sort of urban renewal kind of approach that the developer might otherwise prefer?
Well, I think looking at some of the things that we were hearing about earlier, looking at ways to make it easier to convert an existing house, to adapt it, to reuse it, to expand it, those incentives that make it easier to reuse, I think, are important. I was talking with you earlier today about, I'm intrigued with things that encourage reuse of material rather than deconstructing it. Those are all things that, whether it's through fees or technical assistance or any number of ways, or just the regulations, those are all ways to incentivize, I think, reuse of existing buildings.
During the tour, as I think Nore mentioned, we took him around the city a little bit this morning to show him some of the facts on the ground. And one of the things we discussed was the problem of lot splitting when there are existing multiple lots under one 5,000 square foot lot, and the historic lots of record, as it's sometimes referred to. And one of the proposals in the RIP project is to allow unlimited splitting of those lots within the 1,250 feet of centers and corridors. How, to the extent that you've encountered the same situation, how is that handled in other jurisdictions?
Well, I deal with that aspect less than I do the built form aspect of it on the teams that we work on with the codes, but my colleagues do deal with that some. And I know in Durango, basically, as a part of the rezoning for those neighborhoods that we were working in, they basically consolidated those into single lots so that they couldn't be divided.
Interesting. Okay. Here's one. I am from Boulder, and neither I or most of the people who grew up there can afford to live there anymore. How do we avoid this problem in Portland? Is there a way to zone for compatibility while also keeping the city affordable? Of course, this was Brandon's question in some way too.
Well, I mean, that's the universal question in the country right now. Los Angeles is facing an affordability crisis. They have a affordability ratio is worse than that in San Francisco. Why is that? Because the average income in San Francisco is higher than it is in Los Angeles, and yet the housing prices are maybe not as high as San Francisco, but high enough that it's very, very difficult. So, building affordable housing and supply has, of course, so many variables that are above and beyond my expertise. I agree Boulder is unaffordable. I just recently had an employee who had to leave Boulder because they wanted to had to buy in Denver, couldn't afford a single-family home in any neighborhood they considered livable in Denver, had to buy one of those six-pack units because that's what was affordable to them. So that's part of Brian's question earlier, what do you say to that first-time home buyer? They are in a difficult position. They did not want to buy into that product. It was not their preference. It was not their lifestyle. They would have preferred to have been in a craftsman cottage, but it was out of their reach. So I can't answer that question. We intuitively think there is some relationship between supply and demand. Well, we've created great demand for a variety of reasons throughout the country, and particularly in very desirable communities like Portland. And the market isn't providing affordable housing just about any place except where it is either required, or it's developed by a nonprofit, or it's incentivized. I mean, that's my anecdotal take on it. But there are very few developers who can, much less be willing to just build affordable housing because it's fun.
Brandon, do you want to pick up on you were reaching for your microphone, so.
Well, I think one of the things, and I'm just looking around the room and seeing who's here, and I know we have a number of people here from potential historic districts, parts of the city that are eligible for historic designation, that are today looking at possibilities to designate those areas and subject them to significant design review. Can you talk a little bit about historic designations in the communities you've worked in at the district level and how they've been used to increase compatibility, or what you've seen in other places in terms of the rush to create historic districts? I think here there is some concern that over-designating the city of Portland could result in a situation where we can't meet some of our growth needs because of inner ring historic districts that have fewer opportunities for change. What have you seen other places? What have been some answers? Are there historic district lights or other types of things that those other places use?
Well, yeah, all right, so you've got 2 or 3 questions there about historic districts. Yes, we are seeing in several of the sort of hot developing cities a push toward historic district designation because it's the only neighborhood character tool available. And that certainly has been the case in Los Angeles. There's a backlog of neighborhoods that want to be designated. as historic districts. There is an administrative burden there because typically the design review fee is not set at a level that actually covers the cost of it in most neighborhoods. It's kind of hard. When you're the homeowner and you want to do your kitchen addition and you're being asked to pay all of that time. Yes, there is a rush to it. B, well-written, well-run preservation systems don't stop the ability to have compatible additions, don't stop the ability to have compatible infill where there are non-contributing buildings or vacant lots. There are certainly opportunities for doing that. And communities are looking more at how to accommodate accessory units, particularly in historic districts, and to encourage that as a way of helping to maintain the original housing stock. So it's not mutually exclusive to say that being an historic district limits the ability to have new compatible infill, and in fact, it often does result in good compatible infill. Now, the third part about that, though, is are there other options? And I ran out of time, so I didn't get to talk about conservation districts, and they are preservation light in some respect. They are often an overlay system on top of the base zoning that adds either some additional prescriptive standards without any design review, or they do add design review. A conservation district differs, and there's no absolute rule about what goes into a conservation district, but generally speaking, alteration to an existing building is not reviewed. I can rip out the windows, I can change the siding, but the moment I expand it or add on or replace it, the new construction is subject to review. So that's a difference between an historic district and a conservation district. Its focus is on the character of the mass and scale as you see it from the street. And so, especially where people have not been able to do better underlying zoning, they are looking at that tool as an option. Now, I've mentioned two flavors of those. One is one that is administratively easy. It's just adding some of special standards to that area, but they're still prescriptive standards, and the zoning administrator at the counter can determine if they've met that. And it could be any of those dimensional standards. It could be a requirement of a minimum roof slope. It could be a requirement for a porch facing the street. You can check it off. You know whether or not they've done it. The second kind includes design guidelines and discretionary review. It still can be at a staff level without a board, except for an appeal perhaps to a design board. That's what we're looking at. We're setting up as a part of the Los Angeles system. There will be both of those two kinds of options of conservation districts, CD1 and CD2. That's what we're calling them, clever names. And CD1 is just some additional, and it'll be a limited range of additional standards that you can add above your base standards. And then for those that are close to being an historic district, they either are eligible but politically don't want to be an historic district, or they don't have enough historic resources to justify being an historic district, but they certainly have character that merits design review. They will have that option available to them.
Just to editorialize briefly, we think we've been especially intrigued in some of our older parts of the community. In 1995, Oregon became and still is the only state in the country to require owner consent of all property owners for a conservation district. So we haven't created those since the early 1990s here because we don't have that same option available.
Sorry. Sorry, but I mean, the point is then, look at zoning standards. And I've tried to show you some of those options that get almost to design review through a series of menus of choice, et cetera, where you can build in a certain amount of flexibility and choice, but it is still prescriptive standards, and I would hope would meet the test of meeting the state law.
Getting back to the zoning here, here's a question that relates to the form and zoning dimensionals. We have a 5-foot setback that has a big livability impact on surrounding homes. For it seems to be the focus on setback seems to be on the street side only. How do we consider setbacks in setting up zoning regulations and restrictions on the sides?
On the sides. Well, a couple of the tools that I showed you address that to some extent. The building envelope idea is essentially requiring a setback. You can meet that if the beginning of the side wall is set at 18 feet, and I want to build a 20-foot wall, I can build a house that starts at 18 feet and slopes in or something, and the 20 feet is another 2 feet in, depending on what that angle is. Or I can just start the whole house another 2 feet over, if that's how I want to design it. And part of that might be, if I need to work within that envelope, maybe that's where I'm going to put the driveway to the garage that's in the rear now, because that will fit within my envelope requirement. It'll move my mass over, and I will make use of that added side yard as a driveway. So that's one of it. The other one was the sidewall offset requirement, where after a certain distance you have to step in farther. That is basically creating a second side yard setback deeper into the lot, where more traditionally a backyard space would have been.
Here is one that, and I have to share a personal note. I was in Denver last week, and riding the A train from the airport to downtown Denver, you see not one tree, not one. And so clearly the Denver example and probably the Los Angeles example may not have quite the focus on the tree canopy that we do here. Not true, sorry. So the question here is, what about trees? What's the best way to provide for their preservation for Portland's urban forest? And how does that, where we feel it impacts our environment, our livability, our character of our neighborhoods, how do trees fit into the picture?
Well, again, I deal less with them, but I do recall, say, for example, in the Carmel situation, I guess several communities we've worked in, perhaps several of the mountain communities, require a certain density of tree planting. I mean, one is the sort of the heritage tree category, those that are recognized as being stately old trees that are to be retained, and so some have that kind of a distinction. Others I know have a sort of a replacement requirement of a sort of equivalent mass. So if one big tree comes down, you got to plant 3 smaller trees of certain caliper or something or other to compensate for it. And of course, some of them are in the public realm. They're in the tree lawn and I don't know how that's necessarily affected here, but they are. I guess they're affected if a new curb cut is to be created, and whether or not you're permitted to locate that curb cut there, or you have to shift it to preserve that tree. I guess could be a consideration there.
One of the interesting issues that you raised was the example of the townhouse configuration that got turned sideways, and that wasn't necessarily what was intended. This question kind of follows along with that line. Have you worked in cities that have outlined or incentivized particular multifamily typologies for certain zones, such as courtyards, cottage clusters, village pattern, and how successful it has been? And I would like to suggest also the form that is very frequently found in Chicago of the 2-flat, 4-flat, 6-flat, with large apartments stacked on top of each other that provide for family living in a very compact form. Are there any zoning that specifically focuses on those kinds of forms?
Well, that's our next step in LA is we're trying to figure out how to bring back the bungalow court, because it's a wonderful housing product, and we're told it no longer is built there because of the parking requirements, and so we're going to look to see if indeed that really is the culprit, because now with a willingness to reduce or change how parking is arranged on a site, maybe there would be an incentive to bring that product back. Part of it has to do with which ones are permitted. You know, the way the Denver code is set up, it is set up as a form-based code where certain building forms and types are permitted within certain districts. And it specifically called for the town home cluster as a building type. Unfortunately, that's somewhat how the six-pack got interpreted. So, be careful what you wish for. No, it's a matter of getting the code right there, because that, if that can get corrected, then I think we will start seeing some of those missing middle products that we all need. We definitely want them and definitely need them in the right places and with the right form standards.
How do you define the right spaces? Is that something that's on a percentage basis?
No, that's a neighborhood planning process typically to say what zone are we going to be, in terms of what's the level of density or intensity that we're going to accommodate.
We have about 10 minutes. Are there any other comments that the panel would like to offer, or questions? I've seen you jotting some notes down.
I guess I'll jump in, and I was going to save this one for my last comment, so this will probably be my last question to you. So at this point, residential infill project will go to the city council for 2 hearings and ultimately a city council decision on December 7th? November 16th, in that time frame, and that'll direct us at Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to write code language for the next year. So if you were going to our city council and asking them to think about one thing or asking them one question related to our proposal that'll be going forward, what would your question or advice to our city council be?
Not that we're prone to ask you difficult questions.
Well, yeah. Well, fortunately, I don't know enough about the specifics of the proposal, so I guess that given the tone of what I've been saying today, what would I ask? I would ask how will these regulations support maintaining neighborhood character? Would be a fundamental question, because it seems to me that what I've briefly seen here and from previous visits, the housing stock is incredible. The degree to which the neighborhoods retain their original character here is amazing, and how well maintained so many of them are is really remarkable. So clearly, there's something of value there that needs to be enhanced with new development, not diminished. So my question would be, how will the regulations do that?
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.